Hey there, Ryan Reynolds here. It's a new year, and you know what that means. No, not the diet. Resolutions. A way for us all to try and do a little bit better than we did last year. And my resolution, unlike big wireless, is to not be a raging and raise the price of wireless on you every chance I get. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment required, equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes on unlimited. See mintmobile.com for details.
Today on CityCast Denver. Across Colorado, big fights have been brewing between Starbucks and its baristas for years. And now that battle has made its way to the state capitol. I'm talking to one of the baristas who helped organize the very first Starbucks union at a shop in Superior and who's going to be testifying in front of lawmakers today on behalf of a big change she wants to see in Colorado's labor laws. Today is Tuesday, January 21st. I'm Bree Davies, and here's what Denver's talking about. Liza Nielsen, welcome to CityCast Denver.
Thank you so much for having me.
So a lot of people are familiar with this massive story about Starbucks workers unionizing across the country. But you've been at the center of it from the very beginning. I want to start with that moment when you decided that something needed to change at your Starbucks. What was that moment?
Yeah, so I started working at Starbucks after hearing all about these promised magical benefits and tuition reimbursement. And so that was my primary reason for becoming employed there. And after having been part of pro-labor movements in my past, I started working there and immediately the red flags came up, like immediately. Just treatment from management, the corporate ethos, they really do market that they are they call it partner-centric company.
Just you put this in quotations,
yes,
partner-centric.
Partner, because they call all of their employees partners because we get very small stock share. So we're partners, we're not employees, right? And I think that was kind of a widely known stereotype of the company prior to the unionization efforts. And so I was got by that PR, and my coworker was also very passionate about the labor movement. We were immediately talking about organizing our store, and the first store to unionize, the first Starbucks store to unionize ever had just successfully won their election in Buffalo just a couple of months prior. And we were like, oh, it's time, And so we just really wanted safer working conditions, higher wages, more of a say and more of a level playing field in the workplace. So we immediately began organizing conversations and successfully won our union vote, not after a fight or not before a fight, but we did.
So you mentioned the store in Buffalo organizing before you all did. Were you in touch with those folks? Did you guys sort of share notes?
So we weren't directly in touch with them at the beginning, but since we were among the first 25 stores in the country to organize, back then we were all in touch and sharing notes and honestly going through the same things because the company deployed a really strategic and aggressive union busting campaign from the get-go. And so many of us encountered a lot of the same things and we're definitely in touch.
So I'm thinking about, again, being in the position that you were in, there's a precarity to this kind of job. Like I worked through the recession in retail, which means I was given a schedule sometimes with 8 hours a week on it. You can't live on 8 hours a week. I never thought for a moment, oh, what if we unionized? I was more afraid of what if I lose my job? And so I just wonder, what was this like for you? Like you essentially, when you start this process of unionizing or talking about it, you're potentially putting your own job at risk. You're asking your coworkers to do the same. I would love to know, what was it like? What did you go through when you started to organize your store?
Corporations have a variety of tools against organizing, but the number one tool they have is fear. And it keeps us in line, right? It keeps us not even thinking of standing up. And sometimes it's just like built in societally, inherently. Like our mind doesn't even go there because we're conditioned not to think that way. So that's definitely a huge barrier to organizing because that's just the world that we live in. And it's understandable. People absolutely do need their jobs. It's essential that they have income and benefits and, access to all of the things that we need for childcare and all of those type of essentials to life. So I never blame anyone for having fear, but it's just talking to your coworkers and, building a strong foundation of trust and friendship and camaraderie, and then finding those ways that they may not even realize that organizing or unionizing can help them and gently pointing them out.
But I imagine too, like you said, the fear.
Yeah.
You see this in other workplaces. Like what did you encounter when you say like union busting from when you start to make these changes or at least start these conversations? How did Starbucks react and what does it look like when union busting happens, or what you think, what felt like that was happening?
Totally. Well, it's aggressive and they absolutely can throw a temper tantrum. I mean, every large corporation has different tactics to go into this, but at Starbucks specifically, it looked like immediately we had benefits withheld. And we had our hours slashed, and we had constant threats and retaliation. They had what we call captive audience meetings, where they hold people basically captive and make you
meetings
listen.
Mandatory.
Yes, they make meetings about the union specifically mandatory and talk about why it's not necessary. Don't break up the family, all of that kind of rhetoric. And so they had those, and then they escalated and flew out 2 corporate executives to sit in our cafe for a few weeks and literally have one-on-one meetings with workers and, just basically intimidate people. And then that's when we really started seeing hourly cuts and the withholding of benefits. Like, one of the main asks of the union to begin with was that we have access to credit card tips. No Starbucks had access to credit card tips for a long time. And
customers couldn't tip you on their credit card transactions,
yes.
Which most folks, I would say that's what they used to pay.
Correct. So we could only accept cash tips for a very long time. And so one of the initial asks of those who organized was to have access to the credit card tip function on the machines, the credit card machines. And immediately after organizing began and people were successfully winning their unions, they rolled that out for all non-union stores. So that was like...
So it was like, allegedly could be seen as punishment for union organizing, as saying, well, then these stores who aren't organizing can do the tip thing, but you guys...
Right. It's incentive, right?
Yeah.
So, don't do this. And then, they started illegally firing people. And
how do you mean illegally firing? Like,
yeah. So federal judges have found that many of the firings from of those who were pro-union are actually illegal, and many have been reinstated with full back pay. And like my coworker who I was talking about earlier, my co-organizer from the beginning, she was illegally fired the day after we went on strike. And so, the NLRB has found that was unlawful.
And that's the National Labor and Relations Board.
Correct.
Okay. You mentioned that they would send corporate folks out to sit in the store and do meetings. Did they ever send corporate people out prior to this for other visits?
Absolutely not.
Okay. I just know that can be a common thing
right.
too in retail. Is like,
yeah.
we're having a store visit, everybody.
No. Yeah, I mean, like we would get visits from maybe regional managers or district managers,
but
not like men in suits.
Okay.
Right?
Okay. So I know there was a big strike around Christmas, I remember, with Starbucks employees. What's the very latest with this?
Yeah. So currently, yes, we went on strike over Christmas, our first multi-day strike, and that was extremely successful. We cost the company I think the latest projection was $6 billion in withheld labor, which is massive, and that's a massive win. And it just shows how, workers really do make the profit, not the CEOs. And so we went on strike during that time because we've been in contract bargaining negotiations, which has been 6-month plus long process of creating the contract, the union contract, an agreement between Starbucks and the employees and union members. And so we were able to make great progress in that contract bargaining. We were very excited the company was willing to sit down with us to begin with. And then we got to nearly the end of that contract, and wages and benefits were saved for last. And the company countered our wage proposal with a 1% wage increase, which is, no offense, but laughable, and then refused to really move and were not bargaining in good faith. So we went on strike to try to motivate them to come to the table in good faith. And right now, that's where we sit.
So it's still sort of in limbo?
We have not ratified the contract yet.
Before we hear from our sponsors, I want you to know that we asked Starbucks about some of the claims you just heard from Liza. A spokesperson denied that Starbucks executives ever flew out to Colorado to meet with workers in her store and denied that the company ever intentionally stoked fear among employees. However, CPR reported in 2023 that a federal judge did rule that Starbucks illegally fired one of Liza's fellow workers. The Starbucks spokesperson also told us that the company has, quote, nothing to share about the legislative battle that Liza is going to tell us about right after this break.
Do you plan your vacations based on whether you can speak the local language? With Babbel, language no longer has to be the barrier. I'm David Plotz, the CEO of CityCast, and I went to Mexico City a couple of years ago with my girlfriend, who's a native Spanish speaker, so I just let her do all the talking, like all of it. I adored the city, and now I'm going to go back in a couple of months, but with my college roommates, who are a bunch of middle-aged men, none of us Spanish speakers. When I was younger, I might not have been bold enough to do that, but now I'm not anxious because Babbel has me covered. Thanks to Babbel, I know how to order a taxi, how to give directions, how to order in a restaurant, all the small and useful bits of language that make international travel easier. Babbel's quick 10-minute lessons, handcrafted by over 200 language experts, get you to begin speaking your new language in 3 weeks or whatever pace you choose. And because conversing is the key to really understanding each other in a new language, Babbel is designed using practical, real-world conversations, especially the sort you need while traveling. Food, how to get places. Babbel's tips and tools are inspired by the real-life stuff you actually need when communicating. With a focus on conversation, you'll be ready to talk wherever you go. So I hope I'll see you in Mexico in a couple of months. Or, as we say, espero verte en Mexico en un par de meses. So let's get more of you talking in a new language. Babbel is gifting CityCast listeners 60% off subscriptions at babbel.com/CityCast. Get up to 60% off at babbel.com/CityCast. Spelled BABBEL.com/CityCast. Babbel.com/CityCast. Rules and restrictions may apply.
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. The new year brings new health goals and wealth goals. Protecting your identity is an important step. LifeLock monitors millions of data points per second. If your identity is stolen, LifeLock's restoration specialist will fix it, guaranteed or your money back. Resolve to make identity health and wealth part of your New Year's goals with LifeLock. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
But you've actually left Starbucks at this point, and now you're working as a labor activist full time.
That's true.
Which brings us back to this conversation around Colorado. And you wrote this piece for the Denver Post recently. Can you tell me about this change the local labor community is hoping to see happen through the state legislature this year?
Absolutely. So we're talking about the Worker Protection Act now. And the Worker Protection Act would give workers the freedom to organize in the workplace without unnecessary barriers from some of our outdated labor laws.
Okay. Can you get a little bit more into that? Because, what does that look like in practice? How would that change things for folks that are working to unionize?
Yeah, absolutely. So Our conversation just a second ago about elections and contract ratification is super pertinent to this law that we're talking about. Basically, the way that federal labor law and our state labor law interacts is really confusing. And under the federal law, unions are legally required to represent all workers who work for a unionized store or company. And under Colorado labor law, we have to have a second union election about union security. Does that make sense?
Kind of.
Yeah. So the first election to become a union is a simple majority vote, 50% plus one. And in every other state in the United States, you are then able to enter contract negotiations and proceed with regular unionization procedures. In Colorado, you have to have a second supermajority election, 75%, to be able to talk about union security, which is typically a normal part of contract bargaining. You talk about union security. That's when employees and employers agree upon what union security would look like. And the union security fee is all about getting representation. You pay a small fee in order to be legally represented by the union.
So with this legislation, you all are looking to get rid of that second vote?
Absolutely, yeah. So the second vote is detrimental to workers because, one, it opens up the door for companies to union bust all over again. We see so much union busting prior to that first election. And in Colorado only, we can face that all over again for our second election, where we have to have even more of a majority vote.
So business interests in general, I think oppose this particular proposal. They say that removing that second election would be unfair to workers who might want a job but not want to pay dues to a union. What do you think about that argument?
Of course, the businesses are saying that they don't want this enacted. The outdated labor laws we currently have worked for them extremely well. But when we see corporations, their CEOs becoming billionaires and their workers struggling to get by, it's time to make it an even playing field to organize in the workplace. So that's what this bill would do.
So again, you've been organizing, you've worked with different staffs as well as the one that you were probably very familiar with at your home store in Superior. Do you come across that a lot from other employees that say, this is not really what I'm interested in?
Yeah, there's a seat at the table for everyone. I don't think any organizer would agree with forcing or compelling any worker to do something that they don't want to do. I think that's goes against the ethos of collective action. Of course, we want to fight on their behalf, but no, I don't think it makes sense to compel anybody to do or join any cause that they don't want to.
So did you have to go through the second election yourself at Starbucks? What was that like?
I didn't actually, because the second election happens during contract ratification. And so, like I was saying, our contract at Starbucks is not yet ratified, nor do I work there anymore. But once it's ratified, then they'll have to, face these second elections. And so this was a big conversation amongst organizers and workers in Colorado. What are we going to do to gear up for this second election? And what might the company do? Because the doors are open all over again to union busting, retaliation. And that's another reason that, the Worker Protection Act would help so many of us who are trying to organize in the workplace, because you don't have to have those fears if this bill were to be enacted.
So our governor, Jared Polis, is not really seen as a friend of the labor rights movement right now. In his recent State of the State, he seemed to acknowledge that there's a lot of energy going towards reforming this law. He said, quote, "In the spirit of collaboration, my ask is that if there are any efforts to reform the Labor Peace Act, they include support of both workers and businesses to avoid the rancorous fights of the past." Do you see any possibility or opportunity for this collaboration between business interests and labor organizing?
Well, I think it's important to remember that union members make 10% more than non-union members. And so in Colorado, what that would look like is more money in the pockets of workers who could then spend it on small businesses to boost the economy. So as much as I want to give weight to the idea of benefiting business interests, I think that this does. And what they're really scared of is losing power.
This is a fight now. This fight is coming. We're talking about legislation, which is a whole other animal. But the labor movement is in the midst of this fight. Like, what if it gets ugly? Are you ready for that?
I mean, yes, we're absolutely ready for that as a collective, group working on behalf of the majority of the workers. But I think we're also cautiously optimistic that this will do really well because it really does stand up for the freedom of workers to organize in the workplace and level the playing field with bad actor CEOs. And so I can't help but be optimistic and hope that it doesn't get dirty.
So I want to go back to just like Starbucks. If I'm a customer, I love my baristas, though. How do I support them?
Yeah, I would say support union shops as much as you possibly can. Do some research. We have lists available if you do some Googling of union stores. Absolutely visit those and tip your baristas.
That's helpful, just because sometimes I'm like, I want to support you, but I don't know how to do this because we're in the midst of this conversation about the corporation that you work for.
Yeah, absolutely. I think also just being a mindful consumer is really important. So you're already doing part of the work there, but definitely support union shops.
Well, Liza, thank you so much for joining me. This was great.
Thank you so much for having me, Bree.
After I spoke with Liza, we asked for a response from the Colorado Chamber of Commerce. They confirmed that they oppose the bill Liza is promoting at the Capitol today and directed us to the results of a poll they commissioned alongside a few other local business groups. It found that 70% of voters oppose the Worker Protection Act, including 50% of Democrats. We've heard differently from a number of leading Democrat lawmakers, though, so we'll keep you updated on how this battle develops. And if you're still a little confused about the details of this law, we've got plenty of links and background in our show notes. That's all for today here on CityCast Denver. If you enjoyed this show, why not take a minute to tell your favorite barista about us? Rate the show wherever you get your podcasts and subscribe to our morning newsletter and learn more about us at denver.citycast.fm. And if you love this show, come see us in person at Heyday, an indoor fair with urban flair on Saturday, March 8th. Get your tickets now at heydaydenver.com. We'll be back tomorrow morning with more news from around the city. See you later. Pompey. Sorry. Oh, he's mad.